The sun had dipped low behind the highway, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery reds as the neon diner sign flickered against the darkening horizon. The place had stood for decades, one of those roadside spots where truckers, bikers, and the occasional lost tourist stopped for a strong cup of coffee and a plate of greasy food. It wasn't fancy, but it was a place of respect, a place where people minded their own business until they had a reason not to. Tonight, there was a reason. Thomas "Tom" Grady stepped out of his old Chevy pickup, shutting the door with a solid thunk. His joints ached a little more these days, but he didn't let it slow him down. The faded Marine Corps cap sat snug on his head, his battered leather jacket hanging loose on his broad shoulders. He was old, sure, but anyone who took one look at him knew he was still built from something solid. The kind of man who had seen things, who had lived through things, but some people never learned to recognize that. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. A sharp burst of laughter cut through the parking lot, and Tom's sharp blue eyes flicked toward the group loitering near the row of parked cars. 5 of them. Young, cocky, the type that liked to run their mouths. Leather jackets, gold chains, the stink of cheap beer on their breath. One of them, a tall, wiry guy with a smirk that looked permanent, elbowed his friend and nodded toward Tom. "Hey, check this out," he said, loud enough for anyone to hear. "Some old fossil still thinking he's a war hero." Tom ignored it. He had dealt with worse. He adjusted his cap and took a step toward the diner, his boots crunching against the gravel. But they weren't finished. Another one snickered, slouching against a car. "What's the matter, old man? You lose your walker?" Laughter. Tom exhaled slowly through his nose. This was the kind of trouble he didn't have the patience for. A third one, the ringleader, most likely, took it a step further. Kyle. Slicked back hair, expensive shoes that didn't belong in a place like this. He swaggered forward, blocking Tom's path. "You still play Army, Grandpa?" Kyle smirked, looking him up and down. "Bet you tell all your grandkids stories about how you saved the world, huh?" Tom's hands curled into fists. Not because of the words, but because he had actually known men who had saved the world. And they weren't around anymore. Kyle wasn't done. He reached out, too fast, too bold, and snatched Tom's cap right off his head. "Oh, what's this?" Kyle twirled it between his fingers. "Semper Fi? What's that mean, huh? Can't let go of the past." His friends roared with laughter. Tom went still. Not a single muscle moved, but his eyes hardened. And for the first time, Kyle felt something shift. The laughter around him faded slightly. The air felt heavier. Tom stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his voice low and edged with steel. "Son," he said, "you just made the worst mistake of your life." Kyle let out a nervous chuckle but didn't back up. "Oh yeah? And what's that, Grandpa?" Tom's lips barely curled. "You think I'm alone?" Kyle frowned. Then a deep rumbling voice cut through the parking lot like thunder. "He's not!" Kyle barely had time to turn before the roar of engines filled the lot. From the far side of the diner, parked in the shadow of the building, 6 motorcycles rumbled to life. Chrome gleamed under the neon lights, the engines growling like hungry animals, the sound slicing through the air and sending a shiver down Kyle's spine. The gang turned and their faces changed. The Iron Reapers, a veteran-based motorcycle club. 6 men, each one built like they'd been carved out of stone. Leather vests, tattooed arms, faces lined with experience. They weren't watching from inside the diner anymore. They were standing, moving, walking forward with slow, unshakable confidence. And every single one of them had their eyes locked on Kyle. The leader, Grizz, was the first to step up, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying an air of quiet, dangerous authority. His gray beard barely moved as he spoke. "You want to rethink what you just did, kid?" Kyle licked his lips, shifting on his feet. He wasn't laughing anymore. His friends weren't either. But Kyle, being the fool he was, still had his pride. He sneered. "What, a bunch of grandpa bikers gonna scare me?" Grizz tilted his head. "Number, we're gonna teach you some damn respect." And just like that, the lesson began. Kyle's smirk wavered as the Iron Reapers stepped closer, their boots crunching against the gravel with calm, measured force. There was something about the way they moved. No wasted motion, no hesitation. These weren't some weekend riders looking to play tough. These were men who had been through real battles, real fights, and every single one of them had their eyes locked onto him and his gang like they'd just marked them for judgment. The tension thickened. Kyle's friends started shifting behind him, their cocky postures shrinking by the second. One of them, a lanky kid with nervous eyes, muttered, Man, maybe we should just go." Kyle shot him a glare. "Shut up!" But the fear was setting in. The air had changed, and Kyle could feel it in his bones. Grizz, the leader of the Reapers, stopped just a few feet away. He had the presence of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. His leather vest stretched over his massive frame, tattooed arms crossed over his chest, and his cold, unreadable eyes were locked on Kyle like a predator studying prey. "You boys got a problem with our friend here?" Grizz asked, his voice low and even, but carrying enough weight to stop a train. Kyle swallowed hard. He still had Tom's cap in his hand, but suddenly it felt heavier than it should. Tom hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched when his cap had been stolen. And that was the most unsettling part. The old man wasn't scared. He wasn't even mad. He was just waiting. Kyle tried to puff out his chest. "Look, man, we were just messing around. No harm meant." Grizz nodded slowly, as if considering it. Then his expression darkened. "See, that's the thing," he said. "Men like us, we've fought beside guys who never came home. We've seen kids die before they even had a chance to live. And when we see little punks like you disrespecting a man who's earned more in his lifetime than you ever will, well," he took another step forward, close enough that Kyle had to tilt his head back slightly. "That's when we stop being so friendly." Kyle took an instinctive step back. His pride screamed at him to fight back, to say something smart, to not look weak. But his survival instincts were louder. The other bikers spread out, moving just enough to block any easy exit. Not close enough to trap them, just enough to make it clear that they weren't leaving until this was settled. Kyle's fingers twitched around the cap. One of his friends bolted. No words, no excuses, just turned and ran toward the street. That set something off in the others. Another guy muttered, "Screw this," and followed. A third hesitated, looking between Kyle and the Reapers before shaking his head and peeling off after the others. Kyle was alone now. The realization hit fast and hard. He had spent his whole life acting like he was in control, like he could walk into any situation, say whatever he wanted, and get away with it. But tonight, he had finally run into men who didn't play by his rules. Kyle licked his lips. His bravado was gone. He lowered his gaze, stepping forward slowly, then carefully placed the cap back on Tom's head. His hands shook. He didn't even know why, but they did. The silence stretched. Tom didn't smirk, didn't rub it in. He simply adjusted the cap, giving a slow nod of acknowledgement. Then Grizz leaned in close, just enough for Kyle to hear. "You ever pull something like this again?" he said, his voice a low growl. "And we won't be so polite." Kyle nodded fast. Then he turned, walking quickly toward the road, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept moving until the glow of the diner was far behind him. As he disappeared down the street, the Reapers watched for a moment before turning back toward the diner. Tom, still standing in the parking lot, exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his jacket. "That was something." Grizz chuckled. "Coffee's on us, Sarge." And just like that, they walked inside, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of the engines cooling behind them. The night had settled. The lesson had been learned. The diner was quieter than before, but not in an empty way. It was the kind of quiet that came when people had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. The waitresses moved slower, eyes darting toward the door. A few of the customers who had seen what happened outside were still murmuring about it, some shaking their heads, others nodding like they had seen justice in its purest form. Tom Grady stepped inside, moving at his usual steady pace, not shaken in the slightest. If anything, he looked like he had just walked in from a casual evening stroll. The only sign that anything had happened at all was the way he adjusted his cap, settling it just right on his head like it belonged there. The Iron Reapers followed behind him, their presence just as powerful inside as it had been out in the parking lot. The smell of coffee, grease, and old vinyl filled the air. But something had changed. Respect. That was the scent now, woven into the atmosphere. Grizz slid into a booth, his massive frame making the old seat creak, and the rest of the club followed. A few of the bikers gave nods to the regulars, to the waitresses, to Tom. A young waitress hesitated near the coffee pot before clearing her throat and stepping forward. She wasn't afraid, just nervous in the way people get when they know they're in the presence of men who have seen things. I saw what happened out there. She poured coffee into Tom's cup first, her hands steady, then moved down the row of mugs. I just wanted to say, thanks. That kid was a punk. Tom let out a low chuckle. I've met worse. The waitress smirked a little at that, but her eyes held something deeper, an understanding. Grizz stretched his arms over the table, letting out a slow sigh. Damn kids, he muttered, shaking his head. No respect these days. Tom took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in. Ain't just kids, plenty of grown men walking around like they own the world too. One of the other bikers, Rex, a broad-shouldered man with deep scars on his knuckles, leaned back in his seat. I don't know. That kid looked like he might have pissed himself when you took that step toward him, Sarge. That got a chuckle from the table. Tom just smirked. Didn't have to lift a finger, ain't that something? Grizz nodded. Sometimes the best beatdowns are the ones you don't gotta throw. The diner door swung open again, and for a moment, everyone paused. But it wasn't Kyle, wasn't one of his friends coming back for revenge. It was a middle-aged man, salt and pepper hair, wearing an old army jacket. He stopped near the entrance, eyes scanning the room before they landed on Tom. Slowly, he stepped forward. Tom noticed him immediately, but didn't say anything. He just took another slow sip of coffee, waiting. The man stopped by the table, his hands curling at his sides like he wasn't sure if he should speak. Then he did. Saw what you did out there, he said quietly. His voice was strong, but there was something behind it. Tom nodded. Yeah? The man let out a breath. Yeah, he hesitated. My old man was a vet, fought in Korea. Didn't talk about it much, but he would have liked seeing that. Tom studied the man for a second before setting his coffee down. What's his name? The man swallowed. Arthur Mills. Tom nodded again, slower this time. Arthur Mills, yeah, I knew of him. He didn't have to say more. The man gave a small smile, then shook Tom's hand. Appreciate what you did. With that, he turned and headed toward the counter, like that moment had been something he needed. Tom let out a breath, rubbing his hands together as he watched him go. Grizz leaned forward. That happened to you a lot? Tom smirked. More than you'd think? Another waitress passed by, refilling cups. I think I can speak for everyone when I say we're glad you gentlemen came in tonight. Grizz grinned. Glad to be here, ma'am. Tom lifted his mug. And damn glad to have some decent coffee. Laughter rippled through the booth, but it wasn't loud, wasn't rowdy. It was comfortable. The kind of laughter shared between men who had walked the hard roads, who had seen the worst of the world and still kept moving. Outside, the night had settled. The neon diner sign still buzzed, the parking lot still quiet. Kyle and his boys were long gone, but the lesson would stay with them. Because respect isn't given, it's earned. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. And tonight, those kids had learned exactly how high the price of disrespect could be. The low hum of conversation filled the diner, blending with the clatter of silverware against plates and the steady drip of coffee being poured into waiting mugs. Tom sat back in his chair, his hands wrapped around the warmth of his cup, his fingers rough and weathered from a lifetime of work, of war, of time itself carving stories into his skin. The Iron Reapers settled into easy conversation around him, men who knew what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to carry the weight of memories that most civilians would never understand. Outside, the parking lot had returned to its usual stillness, but the echo of what had happened lingered. The kind of lesson those boys had learned tonight didn't fade fast. It would sit with them, gnaw at them in ways they wouldn't even recognize until later. Until they found themselves looking in a mirror and wondering who the hell they really were. Tom had seen that transformation before, had lived it. Some men changed, others didn't. Grizz leaned back, cracking his knuckles. Hell of a night. Tom smirked slightly, taking a slow sip of coffee before setting the mug down. Not the worst I've seen. Rex chuckled. Not the worst you've seen. Sarge, you had that punk shaking in his overpriced sneakers. Tom shrugged. You don't gotta hit a man to teach him a lesson. You just gotta let him hit himself. The waitress returned, setting down a fresh plate of fries in the center of the table. Her hands didn't shake this time, her movements confident, grateful. She gave Tom a nod before stepping away, like she understood that saying too much wouldn't be necessary. Respect wasn't always in words. Sometimes it was in the quiet things. A fresh plate, a nod, a glance that lingered just long enough to say, "Thank you." Tom exhaled, stretching his shoulders, feeling the weight of the years press against his spine for just a moment before shaking it off. He wasn't a young man anymore, but he was still standing, still moving, still teaching. A few minutes passed in comfortable silence, the kind that only came when men who had seen war shared space without needing to fill the air with useless noise. Then, the door swung open again, and everyone looked up. Kyle stood there, just inside the entrance. But he wasn't the same as before. His cocky swagger was gone. His shoulders weren't squared. His chin wasn't lifted in that arrogant, self-important way. Instead, he looked small, hesitant. His hands twitched at his sides, like he didn't know whether to clench them into fists or shove them into his pockets. His face was paler than before, his bravado stripped away, left raw and exposed under the dull glow of the diner lights. The whole table went quiet. The whole diner went quiet. Kyle knew they were watching. He swallowed hard and took a slow step forward, then another. His movements were careful now, cautious, like a man walking into something bigger than himself. Tom watched him, his expression unreadable. Kyle stopped a few feet from the table, hesitating again, glancing toward the door like he wanted to turn around and bolt, but he didn't. Instead, he forced himself to look Tom in the eye. He cleared his throat, glancing at the Iron Reapers, then quickly back at Tom. His voice was quieter this time, almost uncertain. I wanted to say... Tom arched a brow, waiting. Kyle's jaw tightened, and he exhaled sharply through his nose. Then, with great effort, he forced the words out. "I'm sorry." The words hung there. A full second passed. Then two. The Reapers didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Tom studied him. Kyle shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it, his fingers twitching. "Look, man, He cut himself off, his frustration clear. "I was out of line. He swallowed. "I didn't know who you were." Tom finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. "And now you do?" Kyle nodded quickly. "Yeah, I do." Silence stretched again, but this time it was different. Tom took a slow sip of coffee, then set the cup down and leaned forward slightly. "You looking for something, son?" Kyle blinked. "What?" Tom tilted his head, watching him. "You came back, that means something. Means you're either real damn brave or real damn lost." Kyle looked down, exhaling. Then, after a long pause, he muttered, "I don't know." Tom didn't say anything right away. He let the words sit there, let Kyle hear them, feel them. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. "Well," he said simply, "figuring that out's a good place to start." Kyle looked up, uncertain but listening, and for the first time, he wasn't running his mouth. He was just listening. Tom reached into his jacket, pulled out a small card, and slid it across the table. Kyle hesitated before picking it up. It was simple, just a name and an address. A veteran outreach center on the other side of town. "You ever decide you want to do something more than run your mouth?" Tom said. "Come find me." Kyle swallowed, staring at the card, turning it over in his fingers. Then, without another word, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and stepped back. He turned, heading toward the door, and this time, when he walked away, it wasn't with the same cocky strut. It was with something else, something that looked a little like understanding. The door swung shut behind him, the bell chiming softly. The diner stayed quiet for a moment longer. Then the conversations resumed, just like that. Grizz let out a low chuckle. "Well, damn, Sarge, you just recruited a lost soul." Tom smirked, picking up his coffee again. "Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start.